All right, great. So welcome to round three of ASDC 2022. On the motion, this House believes that developing countries using the exploitation of labor as a strategy for development has done more harm than good. I call this House to order and yield the floor to the Prime Minister. Here.
Okay, hello. Pronunciation session POIs through voice. Yeah, preferably POIs through voice. Okay, one second. I'll I'll start my speech in three, two, and one speaker. As we know today, the US stands as the most powerful country in the world. How did they do so? They did so because they had people stay. They had people make the country a better place instead of leaving it behind. They had people passionate in the idea that they must help their country develop. And for us, we think this is the best way that countries can should take the labor as a strategy, or should take the strategy for development. For this, we stand to propose. For a couple pieces of setup. Firstly, we'll be clear. This debate isn't about people leaving the country, because obviously that's in their autonomy and what they decided to do. What we do have to retroactively assess then is if this was a way for strategic development in a developing country, and that's what we'll have to debate on. Now, let's just talk about how does this strategy manifest. In the Philippines, which is my home country, the government created initiatives in the 70s to the 2000s for people who opt into services needed elsewhere, such as funding the medical field to the point where a surplus of nurses were sent to the states from the Philippines. This happened through funding courses to becoming a nurse and generally making it more accessible to those who aspired to earn more. The same thing happened for seamen and other office work elsewhere. It was also manifested through making exploration easier, like helping the logistics such as flying these people out, making sure they had a job overseas, and creating deals with other countries. So why is it important? What are the implications of this method? Two things. Firstly, it is generally coercive because of the fact that the government made it a social norm that it was the correct path to become a nurse or seaman just because there was opportunities elsewhere. This meant the development in other fields and other kinds of jobs were slowed down because this narrative making other people opt into more popular work. Secondly, it wasn't only the norm, but the process to create the norm made it so that meant that the funds could have gone to other fields, didn't go to them because they were again seen as less important. And now, what are the harms of this? Again, two things. Firstly, other fields are essential, just die out. Like a lot of people become nurses, but doesn't mean it's more Filipino became doctors because that's just not true. They
POI.
just they just became the same person that was taught the same thing that made them dispensable. Secondly, when these things stopped becoming essential, when nurses were no longer essential, they were dropped from the States and sent back to no jobs because it was no longer essential. This means that the Philippines could no longer export, and that the resource they invested into nursing was no longer able to be used. And B, later on, we'll deal with this. We'll deal with this even if they were still essential. It's
Information.
bad for the country. So B, what are the other alternatives could have been used instead? To be clear, we're giving alternatives that could have been employed and could have been happened at different degrees at the same time. Firstly, it is through industrialization and trading with other countries, with exploring other things like rice or other products that they make already. The idea is this is how Taiwan had sustainable economy, making their semiconductors essential, or how China was generally able to industrialize through two things. Firstly, manpower in China were low. If people wanted low manufacturing costs, they would send products to China so that they could make product cheaper as the mass produce. That looks like Xiaomi, Realme, and Huawei. And secondly, this meant that manpower was really cheap and that corporations were incentivized to go there because of it being cheaper to enter the market in the first place. So why do we prefer this? Three things. Firstly, even if we can't do it perfectly, we say that keeping workers within the country is still better for efficiency, i.e., creating facilities, finding ways to export your own products, and etc. Secondly, on keeping capital, because we can guarantee it goes to the country, not any other country. And thirdly, this is only exclusive on our side because the necessary manpower on upside is diminished to the point where the majority of their
Clarification.
population was spread across the world. Now let's just talk about our counterfactual. We concede that maybe we're going to have fewer programs to make people go abroad for work because in our world, we would rather direct these people into non-transferable amenities that are located in these developing countries. So what does our model look like? It looks like a developing strat on our side, which is redirecting security, infrastructure, and education. This looks like these developing countries need this, i.e., they need teachers, they need architectures, and they need architects, they need doctors and security. And when you have more schools and more infrastructure, likely other countries will either visit this developing country, work here because there's more jobs open. Meaning you create these kinds of when you create these kinds of infrastructure, you get other countries to invest in these things. So I'll extend on these later. So move on. Actually, before I move on to my argument, yeah, I'll take the POI.
So just to be clear, your side will not support the exportation of labor, even in special circumstances like economic
That's not what we
downturns.
said. We've already clarified in the start of our speech that it is on the people's autonomy to be able to go to other countries. What we're saying is that we don't think that is the most viable strat for development. That's already in our clarification. Moving on to my first argument. They will move based on where they work. Firstly, that is to say, if someone gets a job in the US and study there, for the simple idea that they're already familiarized with the way of life and like they want to of course keep their job there, they will likely stay. That is simply say when these people have already decided to, for example, study in the US, get a job in the US, they likely want to stay and likely they would choose to not go back into their homeland for the simple fact that they already used to the way of life that is happening there, and they of course want to be able to keep their job in that place. Meaning this affects the developing country because the requirement of manpower skill that the person possesses now going to not to them but to the US instead. Secondly, people are likely to take their families with them to where they live. This is a direct continuation of my first point. That is, say that people when they realize that this place is better off, i.e., like the US is likely is better likely, so they would try to save up or ask their families to also go save up money for them to be able to choose to fully migrate to the country. So again, the same horse exists when people choose to leave, and again when less people choose to stay, which means that the second generation of people, i.e., those people's kids, will not be in that home country. They will instead stay in that country now, not the homeland, which also again takes away the development that these people could have provided to this homeland when they choose to now give it to the country of which they're in right now, which is likely one of those bigger countries. Now, thirdly, development does not work in the way that OP wants to imagine. Development is needed with resources, manpower, and money. And money, all these things that are contingent on literal people and literal manpower, these things are contingent on people being able to do it. That is to say, to be able to develop, we need resources, manpower, and money. But all of those things are contingent on people in the country, i.e., the country needs people with skill to be able to do these things. And likely, when the best of the best are already exported to other countries in the hopes of development, you lose contributions in the architecture, medicine, etc., and that these people could have provided. And like in addition to that, the simple idea is likely the people who are being exported are the ones who the countries would view as the best. So when these people are already being exported, likely what their contributions to science or their contributions to medicine, architecture, probably likely won't be even going to the home country as a whole anymore. It would likely be going to that country because again, these people of course will get a job there, and they of course want to support that country in a sense. So the harm in what I've just told you is very simple. You lose out on creating more job opportunities again for countries to develop. They of course need infrastructure, job opportunities, and making more hospitals, making more schools, which opens up job opportunities for other foreign workers and even local workers to opt into. Which means you get better development when instead of focusing on exporting, you focus on the idea of first self-building instead of focusing on importing and not exporting as the main primary strategy of development. That is, say again, this debate is not about barring people from going out and going to other countries. This debate is about what is the most viable strategy for development and likely which strategy should be prioritized. This debate is about analyzing if exporting is the best development strategy. And again, we hear the proposition, do not think that, for the simple idea that for countries to develop, it is contingent on the people in their own countries to be able to build up their own countries instead of them exporting and just praying to God and praying to whoever that these people would come back to their countries and support the country in comparison to support the other country of which they've already been in. And for all these reasons and more, stand the proposition.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. And now call the Leader of Opposition. Here.
Okay, cool. Just give me a second to finish my notes and set up my timer. Okay. Okay, my time starts in 3, 2, 1. I think generally in the status quo, developing nations need market confidence and they need investments. That is the case where in majority of cases, keeping your labor to yourself is not mutually exclusive towards strategies of exploitation of labor. I think generally the burden on opposition side is that it's a normative debate. That is to say, we need to compare the positives of exportation of labor that outweighs the benefits. We do not have to defend this strategy and just like exportation of labor in like a vacuum, right? That is to say, we are allowed to defend historical applications of the strategy. We don't have to just to say like exportation of labor is good or bad. It is the strategy that governments get to control and gets to control of how much people actually are exported in this strategy. So first, I want to talk about the definition of what exportation of labor looks like, because this is not structurally explained on their side. I think firstly, governments can subsidize workers to work abroad with local companies stationed in foreign countries. Secondly, it can open up hiring opportunities of foreign companies to hire local workers. And thirdly, just note that the government controls the strategy, right? Therefore, the government is more likely going to tailor the specific plan in accordance with national economic situation. That is to say, the government is unlikely going to just like let everyone and export every single worker into the United States, because that's not in the interest of the government to do so. So therefore, our stance is that we're able to improve the economic situation for countries and individuals, because developing countries need market confidence, they need investments, and for individuals in times of specific crisis that developing countries are far more prone to, they need to access sustainable pay in any shape or form. So firstly, I want to just talk about the clarification, because government would like to presume a counterfactual that, okay, it's better to keep workers domestically. The issue is that their counterfactual is not mutually exclusive. Like no country will allow literally every worker to leave. Presumably the majority of the workers that are employed will still stay in the country. We'll probably still have MNC investments. We'll still probably have exports. We're just saying that the people who cannot find employment, cannot find jobs, that is the interest of the government to export them, because there's actually no opportunity to find them. But furthermore, we posit that there's a lot of overpopulation in developing countries, that people just literally cannot find a job, or literally cannot find shelter. Exporting these people specifically, that the government is more likely going to do, is the more likely status quo that we live in. So I want to provide two arguments. Firstly, talking about under the scenarios of actual economic downturn, and secondly, talking about even in the normal scenarios where we're able to build trade relations, we're also able to have skilled and profitable workers. So first, I want to talk about the sustainability of citizens' livelihood under times of economic downturn. And the framing is just that when governments employ the strategy of exportation of labor, is generally when governments, like we already proved that generally governments like economy to stay domestic, right? And export, like all the financial circulation to stay within the country. And it's only when there are times of national crisis, when people cannot find employment, when people have no income and spending power, that they do employ this strategy, keyword being strategy. So the first layer, how do we maintain sustainable income for those in need? Because when there is an economic crisis, people literally cannot access jobs, right? People can be in the labor force, right? Like for example, COVID. When workers are able to find opportunities elsewhere, like in China, factories and labor-based economies can provide a far more sustainable income elsewhere. This looks like, for example, simply providing wages, right? You're actually employed. But this also means, like, for example, you have shelter and food when the companies provide you with that. So therefore, I think this is a massive benefit in where millions of families will suffer if they cannot find a breadwinner family, even if the breadwinner is like overseas and sending remittance home. The second layer is how we increase market confidence, because when workers are working in a foreign country, the pay that they receive are more likely going to be spent, right? Like they need to spend it on food, they need to send it to their family in order for them to survive. When people have more money, this increases the market confidence, simply because when people spend, there's an incentive for producers to continue to produce. It continues a cycle of a trade and a relationship where basically you can have a market of supply and demand. If no one is spending, then there is no incentive to jumpstart the economy at all. This is extremely important because aids the speeding up of a recovery of a national crisis, an economic crisis, because if no one is spending, there's no way to jumpstart the economy, even if you're able to manage to pass like economic packages in times of economic crisis. Before I move on, are there any POIs? Okay, moving on. The second argument we have is that it's even under normal circumstances, like in the general days, it's still beneficial. The first layer is that we have skilled and profitable workers, and this is directly clashing with the brain drain argument that proposition wants to like provide. Because their one-liner is just that, okay, because we go to that company, we stay in that country, and then we like that country. This is just firstly an assertion. We give you two different reasons. Firstly, there's generally remittance, right? Like you're living in a developing country, you're from a developing country where the family presumably might be suffering because you previously didn't have a job. The delta on our side is that basically the finances are majority still spent within the country, right? You have remittances, you send your money home, and then the money is spent within the country. But furthermore, there's unlikely going to be brain drain because the family is in the country, and when workers return, they're more likely going to utilize the skill. And the reason why workers will more likely going to return simply because of the fact that like they have more opportunities when the economic crisis is over, they're more likely going to return, right? Like there is no guarantee that like the exploitation of labor means that there's no importation of labor as well. But secondly, we actually increase trade relations because firstly, we have generally individual connections to companies, right? Like when workers can go to like foreign companies and they can actually work there, and they're more like able to, for example, establish a connection with the manager there. That just means it's generally better because you have workers that actually have a accessibility to markets, and certain markets that generally local workers cannot access. But secondly, we're able to establish connections with like MNCs, right? So supposedly, if you send your worker towards like Amazon, then you generally by accessing these markets and accessing the management of these companies, we're more likely going to promote these MNCs to come in and invest in us because we have over the amount of labor, and that is a profitable opportunity for these MNCs to enter the country. That just means that first, we get far more infrastructure on our side because MNCs are more likely to invest. Secondly, we have generally more investment opportunity because when you have a large multinational company coming in, lots of people can invest in this company when the stocks are unavailable elsewhere. But thirdly, when you get just like, for example, like ASEAN, you get economic prosperity by the simple fact that you have more employment when a company comes into your country. And these are all things that developing countries need in order to develop their own their own economy and the livelihoods of people that actually need the payment for the payment, the wages, and the infrastructure that these companies provide. So for these reasons, I'm extremely proud to be opposed. Thanks.
I thank the Leader of Opposition and call the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Hello, just to check, am I audible?
Yep, audio is great.
Great, thank you. Okay, so just to preface my speech, pronouns are she, her, TOI through voice. Just don't badger. Okay, so I think my speech done. In 3, 2, 1, go. I urge opposition to stop dancing around the middle ground. They can't claim that people will stay in these developing countries while at the same breath say that these people need to leave the country if they want to earn more money. Stop relying on your soft stance. One thing I want to reply on before I have all my rebuttals integrated. Firstly, they talk about how people will need to if they want to go out of the country, they can. I think that one, we just need to point out how this framing is really convenient for opposition side. Firstly, they say that the government is really smart and they can do it in a crisis. We think that countries such as the Philippines, who weren't in a crisis, and India, who weren't in crisis, have many other developing countries that are not in crisis currently. Moreover, they did not do this smartly. The idea why we have it in the first place is because you're sending a large amount of the population across the world. We know that's extremely bad. But secondly, they also talk to you about how they get more trade relations. But I think it's literally not something exclusive. We can still get trade on our side, but arguably we can get a lot much better. And thirdly, they say that even if people did not have any purchasing power, they could still do so through other strategies from the government. We say that even if that happens, it's still a lot much more harder to get people to actually invest in your country when you have nothing to go after. So what's the main clash in this debate? I think that firstly, coming from our side, we tell you that the development requires the manpower if you want to start anything. Because any assets that you have will have to start between someone trying to create them in the first place. Going on all they talk to you about how the international investments are really important. But going on to both of them, right? I think it is a prerequisite for any investments from to have our counterfactual or our model work before anything. Why? Because you do not have the institutions in your country for people to have jobs or people have job opportunities for, or you have the companies for these people to invest in. You literally have no fixable, fixed valuable assets for your country. Meaning, what are these people actually going to invest on? Even if opposition manages to find the richest people in the world who are trying to find assets and assets to invest their money on, the fact that this developing country has nothing to incentivize these people to stay makes all of their efforts useless. That's the reason why, coming from Aki's speech, we already framed to you why we're going to direct a lot more of our own money and our own funding into infrastructure, into education, hospitals, and things like that. Because these are now ways for people to actually have job opportunities. Now reasons for people to want to invest into all of these companies so they can now earn money and have a living. I think it's really important. Before I go to my extension, I'll take that UI.
You just said that governments are unable to smartly use exportation policy, but you don't prove why governments will automatically involve in education much better than we do in exportation strategy. I think clearly exportation has a lot of benefits, and the government will try to
Okay, it's
maximize.
overtime. But going on further, right? We think that even if you're going to say that, oh, they don't have the amount of money to like I don't know, portray like their education things like that. The reason why that happens in their status quo is because you're already like currently people in the status quo are already so fixated in trying to get people outside and trying to get like OFWs or like overseas workers to come back to go back to your country. But yeah, it's really unsustainable. I'll go on that later. Going on to extension then. But like before that, opposition stance said that they need to bring in more money to circulate the economy, but realize that this is all reliant on the idea that these overseas workers are going to bring back money to their families. Why that's very unlikely. We tell you that firstly, the fact that there are already people in the breadwinners of the families who are already having jobs outside the country means that the like vast majority of cases, it means that they're likely to bring their families along with them because of proximity, and people just proximately want to be together. So because of that, you're taking away a lot of the manpower away from these developing countries. You're taking away a lot of the resources that these developing countries like substantially need. So going on to extension then, firstly, which is extremely unsustainable for you to depend on these people and depend on like families like who are like based off of like other countries and also developing countries. The goal of this motion is to maximize the development and to apply the best strategy to do so. Meaning that what we want on both sides is to get like, this developing country outside of the category of being a developing country. We want to boost their stance in like the international stage. We want to increase productivity in advancement and etc. Why is opposition's paradigm extremely more unlikely for this to happen and to achieve that? I think opposition is highly reliant on the ability to deliver the inflation to like current currency and conversion things like that. Because what they want to do is then get like the larger like valuable money, and then when the prices just increase and things like that, they're able to sell it and therefore earn more money. But realize this all reliant on like people wanting to stay in this developing country and other people as breadwinners on the like more like in places like the West and like Singapore and etc. like that. We think it's extremely bad on their side because then at the point at which all their family members are able to move to this country, you literally lose the circulation to your market. You then have nothing to like actually create your prices. You literally have no money in your system. Why is that bad then? It means then that the markets are more like to crash because people do not have the money to circulate. But even further from that, realize that you're so dependent on other countries, and this is exactly what a developing country does not want. They want to be independent. They want to be able to have systems on their own that are not reliant on other people. We say for that they can't actually win this debate. But moving further, right? Why is it like so bad on their side? We think that money is something that's extremely substantial. As like for the first reason, it's that the simple fact that people who have to work overseas will need to be able to pay their own homes. They have their own daily needs and things like that. Meaning that the money they have is likely to be very much deducted by all these spendings that they have in this brand new country that's probably a lot much more expensive in like living costs. Meaning that these people, when they're going to be sending back money to like these developing countries for their families, it's going to be extremely less in comparison to the amount of money they earn. That's the reason why they bring their families outside. That's the reason why opposition's like entire strategy is not going to work. But why is our plan just then a lot much more better? We tell you that at the point at which you even increase the education or even just create like more hospitals and things like that, people are more likely to one get the like actual like substantial need that they have and like the needed support that they get from the government. But secondly, it's also a way for people to gain job opportunities. At the point at which you're able to like create like better education like methods for these like youth in that developing country, they're more likely to gain like a lot more power over how they want to like create their own jobs and things like that. That's the reason why we're able to circulate like the knowledge that's being able to like be portrayed and pursued by this like developing country. But further from that, really these countries also need these kinds of infrastructure anyways. That's the reason why when we're able to actually like mostly focus a lot of our funding on that, we're also then able to like also manage like the government and also allow them to make sure that the money that they're actually trying to save is actually going to stay into like this developing country rather than it like, constantly just going out and all with so many more like scholarships and things like that. They're trying to promote people to leave the country. Why is it then so important on our side? Why is it so much better? Because it means on our side, the strategy and the counterfactor that we impose to you, it's one where importing is more focused on rather than than exporting a lot of people. Because note the development starts within this country, with its people, with its resources, not through exporting them away and away. I think with that you're just going to be losing the one like edge that you have against other people, but hoping that these people will just come back. Because realize again, bringing back the brain drain that Aki told you earlier, the reason why brain drain is actually an issue in these problem in these like, developing countries is the idea that these people probably do not want to go back when they already have a life outside of another country. There's a reason why their paradigm will never work. This is why we got to win today. Very proud to propose. Thanks.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister and call the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Here.
Okay, can I just confirm that I'm clear and audible?
Yep, very much so.
Right, thank you. Just wait, hold on a second. Just get my timer ready. All right, time will start. Oh yeah, by the way, verbal POIs, please, and he, him pronouns. Yeah. So time will start in 3, 2, 1. Two clarifications right off the bat. First of all, we're kind of confused as to why proposition is bringing in counterfactual, because know that this debate is a harm versus good debate. We're talking about an issue that has already happened in the past. We're supposed to be weighing these specific impacts, the positive impacts versus the negative impacts. So when proposition comes here and tells you that, well, the counterfactual here is essentially that we give individuals education, we spend all that money that we previously spent on exporting workers into the education system. You have to, first of all, prove that this is a unique incentive at the time for all of these countries to do. Second of all, that this education system, this incentive is going to outweigh any other alternative. They haven't done any of that. They sort of assumed that education would just be the thing because of an arbitrary sort of fiat on their side. We just don't think this applies to them because this debate is entirely about weighing the impacts specifically of exporting labor in the first place. Second of all, the burden of opposition here is to prove to you why specifically the past has already been over, why this past has led to us being able to have better impacts in general. Note that even if we take the absolute best case coming from their side about impacts of brain drain, if we're able to prove to you that these developing nations will be better off either way, even with brain drain, I think we already take this debate anyways. Now then, I'll just focus on 3 issues in my speech. One, on this entire issue coming from side proposition, which is basically the entire case on this issue of brain drain. Second, which side is going to get a better circulating economy. Third, on the long term with international cooperation, where we're able to take this clash as a whole. First of all, just on the issue of brain drain itself, because this is where proposition puts all their eggs into one single basket. Proposition essentially tells you, well, under the status quo today, under the system that you're going to be exporting labor, people are just only going to be incentivized by staying outside, and they're not going to ever come back to your original nation. I just want to highlight 2 things right off the bat. First of all, their own framing here tells us that the individuals who want to be able to go to other nations by their own choice, by their personal autonomy, is completely fine. They're not considered part of this debate. We agree. What we're talking about are workers who are exported. Basically, these individuals that are working inside a lot of companies that work closely with the government are basically being pushed outside the country to be able to work in different nations in the first place. These individuals are typically, 1, lower skilled labor force workers. Second of all, individuals who are typically alone in the first place. Because don't buy into their characterization that, well, this means that you can suddenly bring all of your family outside. Sure, that might be the case for an individual who's going to study abroad and work abroad by his own choice, but for exporting laborers and for a lot of these individuals, especially inside developing nations, this typically isn't the case because governments can only be able to send so many people out at once. Therefore, note that we are talking about individuals who basically go out there to do unskilled labor, which are unlikely going to mean that you're suddenly going to be so prosperous that you're not going to be able to come back to your country in the first place. Now then, just to explicitly respond to this, 3 responses. First of all, realize that for a lot of these individuals, they have active incentives to go back home. They want to be able to spend more money for their family that are basically starving back at home. They want to be able to help them buy more things so that they'll be able to have a happier life. This is a natural incentive for a lot of these individuals, especially in developing nations, because the emphasis placed on familial ties. Say, for example, in China, when they're exporting labor, individuals will often always come back and be able to provide remittances for their families because it is often taught inside families. You have to be able to respect your elders. You have to care for your parents when they were old. Therefore, inside most of these cases, especially in developing countries, you have much more incentives to try to send more money and try to be physically back for your family. Second of all, realize that for a lot of these individuals, they have the active incentives to come back with their nation when it's already economically fine now. Because realize that under the cases that this strategy is going to be employed, as our first strategy very clearly highlighted to you, because these are the cases of high economic crisis. Once this crisis is over, there's nothing stopping all these individuals coming back to find much more employment in the long run anyways. Therefore, these individuals still have an active incentive to come back when they're able to see their family again and is still able to find work. Third, even in the best case of side proposition, that these individuals don't come back and they're no longer part of the labor force. Realize that remittances are an incredibly powerful method of being able to sustain economies. Because even if one person is not going to be able to come back to your nation, the fact that you provide so much more economic income, the fact that you provide your family with more money so they can freely spend it on other corporations, means you're able to foster a lot more employment in your local economy in the first place. Therefore, individuals who weren't exported are now able to find better jobs. They're able to they're able to access better education based on the fact that there's much more economic activity that allows governments to fund these specific institutions in the first place. Therefore, even if individuals don't come back, you're still able to get the unique benefit of remittances, which they don't. Because first of all, they don't explain to you why specifically there's another way for them to be able to make money. Second of all, why it's the best way to make money. We already told you that it's the active best choice for a lot of these nations, especially in times of economic crisis. Therefore, based on this point, I think we take this point down because the simple fact that one, they don't acknowledge their own framing. Second of all, we already told you that even if it is true, you still get remittances, something that is actively great inside those cases. Before I move on, sure, I'll take a point.
Is allowing others to leave to work the same as the government employing an overall strategy?
The government is employing the strategy to be able to send workers that are going to work abroad to be able to make money for themselves. I think this is the way that governments want to be able to think about this. This is the way that governments have done this with throughout history. Now then, on the second issue of the money circulating inside the economy, because proposition here just basically tells us that we are unlikely going to be able to access things like investments because your entire market crashes. Your entire market crashes because simply enough, there's not enough capital inside and there's not enough assets inside your nation to be able to help anyone be able to develop. Note two things here. First of all, we agree that these sort of specific nations probably are going through a harmful economic crisis. It is a matter of how well we're going to be able to utilize our workforce, our overpopulated workforce, to be able to better help the situation. We already told you very specifically in our first why we're able to solve this. Because of the fact that individuals inside these nations are unsustainable, because of the fact that the government has to cater to so many people at once who are already unemployed. Sending them out is not actively, first of all, a lot less burden on the government themselves, so they'll be able to spend more money on other things. Second of all, people are able to send remittances back. Third, you're more likely going to get skilled work when they come back eventually to see their families. Note that therefore, under the issue of economic activity, we win for two reasons. A, we already told you the specific nuance as to why we are able to get remittances back, which is the most easy way to be able to get economic activity. Second, because of the fact that we've already formed a sort of tie with other nations, more corporations like MNCs are more likely going to invest in us. Don't buy into the characterization where they say that it's going to be symmetric on both sides. MNCs will still invest on their side because realize that there's simply no incentive for them to do so, especially in a dilapidated economy in the first place. Now that you're able to send workers, you're able to put some sort of reliance on a lot of these developed nations onto the developing nations. So basically, in a sense, developed nations rely on developing nations to be able to send some sort of work so that they be able to profit off of it. Therefore, you're able to get more investment. And third, just very briefly, on the long term, because finally we get more investment, you're actively able to fund things like educational programs. You no longer have to rely on this program in the first place. We think in the status quo today, you see how large nations like China previously were developing. Now that they've exported work, have become developed as a whole. We think this process is successful. We are so proud, therefore, to oppose.
Thank the DLO for the speech and call the government. Here.
Hello, am I audible and visible?
Yep, audible and visible.
Okay. I'll start. Pronouns are he/him, and then I'll take POIs through first. So just interrupt me. Okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The way we'll win this debate is incredibly simple. The first is we'll debunk the claims coming from their side, and secondly, we'll debunk the convenient framing that they had. Because I have three things to clarify. I have firstly on the motion, because we have to clarify firstly that this motion is retrospective. So the kind of frame that they try to do is largely like just convenient. Why is this the case? We think that from first we were able to explicitly tell you what this strategy actually looked like. It looked like having so many workers going out of the country. It looked like so many workers being incentivized to work in those kinds of things in the first place because the government funded things like courses or the government funding things like going outside of the country. But this isn't only like a small part. It was a large part of the budget because it was necessarily like one of like the huge ways for the government to actually use it as a strategy. So what does this look like? The first thing is we told you clearly that if it was a bad thing, right? If you went out in another country, it looked like being exploited by that person or by a company, or it looked like being not being able to earn a lot. But the second thing is we engage on the worst case. case, or on how even if it was like good for yourself, it was not even like, and you got good pay, it wasn't likely to be good. On how you weren't likely to come home. Well, even if they tried to say, well, you're gonna go home because of your family, because of your friends, because that's where you came from, it's not likely the case, because if you do care about your family, you would have wanted them to go out, because if you're like debating on the like in the context that it's a crisis, then obviously you would want to take away your family from a country that had a crisis. So if it was a crisis and you were doing well, then obviously you would want to take them out. That's why brain drain is likely to happen, even if we're engaging on their frame. So in those two ways, on how you're likely to be exploited, or the second, on how even worse, on how you weren't able to, or on when you aren't exploited, it's still a bad thing. So that's just disproving how the convenient frame was actually likely to happen. But the second thing is on the counterfactual. You were very clear on how even if this is a valid judgment debate, right? We do agree on that. We still explain how the absence of this is likely to be good, or the absence of this kind of strategy, because we told you specifically the kinds of alternatives we had. Because our only alternative isn't education. Actually, we don't have to prove why this is the only alternative or why this is the best alternative, but we give you a multitude of alternatives that could be used or that could have been done instead of this. So one, it looked like education, that it came from our second speaker, but it also looked like trading, right? Because they tried to say, this trading won't happen because you won't like go into those countries in the first place. But actually, nah. I think that in a lot of cases, these kinds of corporations still have incentives to go into places like developing countries because they still have a lot of manpower. It's very clear, right, from industrialization, coming from Aki, that these kinds of corporations still have large incentives because of the manpower, but also because of the land that you could have used for your corporation. So insofar as those are the cases, right, it's also likely to happen. But yeah, like adding to that, a lot of it is like largely cheaper, which is why China was able to industrialize more. But the third thing I'll try to clarify is that there's an important distinction between what is a strategy and just allowing someone to go out of the country, because they tried to say that this completely soft stance of how, if we allow people to work outside, that is something that's completely viable, that's a strategy. But we told you specifically first that that's not what the strategy looks like. Note that the distinction here in the POI a while ago was very important, because allowing someone to go outside of the country isn't the same as an actual strategy, because an actual strategy for economic development, like, it's putting a lot of money into it, being able to invest in those kinds of things. If you're not investing a lot in it, then it's probably not like even like a strategy you're working on. So you have to still debate on like the frame of how it's like, or what it looked like in the Philippines, or like maybe India. So given those three things, I think that the first thing is you're able to like just rebut a lot of their claims on how they're on like in their framing, and how like a lot of their claims weren't actually likely to happen. But even if they were, it was still a bad thing, because you were able to prove why it's still a bad thing, because even if those claims are true, I'll like prove now on my issues why it's still a bad thing. So yeah, but before I move on, I'll take a PO if there's any.
So obviously people will feel somewhat alienated when they're in a foreign country. So it's reasonable to assume that they still want to come back or want to contribute to where they literally grew up, right?
No. But like the context you tried to work with was how in your own country there was a crisis. So even if you feel alienated, you would want to not go back to a country that was in a crisis because you aren't gonna earn any money. But even if you are gonna earn if you are gonna earn money back in that country, it's still in a crisis. So you would want to take away your family from that crisis, because like obviously you would want them to be in a better place. So that's why brain drain happens. Okay, firstly then on firstly on my issues, what happens to the country's development even if we're buying into the frame that okay fine they can do the soft stance. The first thing is that we'll engage on like if it's real. I have a few responses to this and just like pointing out the flaws on their side. The first is a prerequisite of this actually working is if the job that you're likely to get is going to be good. But we already pointed out in a lot of cases like you're likely to be exploited, right? You're seen as someone that's like a foreigner, things like that. Even if you create deals, it doesn't look like they're gonna be good deals. But the second is also important, because even if you don't believe that, like it is all, you have to question if the job you're doing is actually something that's essential. Because we told you, it was highly likely that even if you were going to be exported away from a country, it doesn't mean that your job is going to be completely essential in a lot of cases. Because of the cases, for example, when you were when like in the Philippines, like the crisis came because of the fact that the Philippines sent so many nurses to America, and when nurses were just not that popular anymore, were not that essential within America, a lot of them lost jobs. A lot of them had to go back to the country without a job. And the problem there is that firstly, the resources when you came back to the country was put into nursing. So obviously you have to the resources there wasn't able to have the country. But the second thing is a lot of people lost jobs. They weren't able to work because they weren't able to be taught in other ways. But the last thing is, even if you don't believe all of that, I think that it was still very bad, because a lot of these people a lot of these people weren't able to work. But let's say it's not the case. Let's say it was kept essential. We also engaged in that case because presumably if it was kept essential and you could stay in that country and you could work and you can earn so much more money, then presumably you could go away and just bring your family, right? That is something that could completely happen. Which means that if your family, the people that are actually adding to adding to the economy because they're the ones spending your own money, if they go to another country through brain drain, then obviously they can't help the economy because they're already away from that country. So the main point of this rebuttal is explaining, firstly, even if it is a good even if it is a good job, it isn't likely to be good for the country because you're likely to go away. So the benefits of trade, things like that, just go away if there's no one, there's no manpower on the ground. But the second thing is, I think you have to also talk about how in a lot of cases that's actually not what happened, right? What actually happened is the jobs weren't seen as essential, therefore they left, and we're not seen as essential. So now they go back home, but they have no resources to just have things that are better for developing countries, which is especially bad because those kinds of developing countries need those resources the most. So what happened to those people? I think I already answered the second issue. What happened to those people was something that's bad, but moreover, moreover, those kinds of things trickle down. So if the economy is bad, obviously the people in that economy will also suffer. So for all these reasons, we prove firstly why on their side, we just debunk a lot of their claims by explaining the frame. But the second thing, why our argumentation still stands. Proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gov Whip. I now call the Op Whip. Here.
Yeah, sorry. Can everybody see me and hear me clearly now?
Yep, not a clear.
Great. All right. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. What proposition needs to realize is that the nature of a strategy means that the government can use it when it deems necessary. This means that in special economic circumstances, for example, when you do have an economic downturn, or when you want to help your citizens go and find opportunities abroad, this is going to be what governments are used. It is a tool and not necessarily something that you must use every single time. On this basis, in the circumstance where it is used, we're going to say that it is a very good thing. I'll answer this debate in 3 questions. First of all, I want to ask you about the citizen livelihood, who benefits individual citizens, and by extension, families. Secondly, how is this strategy used in special economic situations? And thirdly, about the power of developing countries that, for example, alliances like ASEAN. Before that, I'm going to clarify the burdens of this debate, because there's obviously a trade-off, right? But Prop tells us that they will allow people to go out of the country nonetheless. All the while, they give us harms about workers going outside. They must concede ultimately that most individuals on their side of the house still stay inside their country most of the time on proposition, because that's going to be that's the only thing that makes sense and is coherent with their case. Everything else about how they can also have opportunities just doesn't make sense. Therefore, we think that they needed to prove 3 individual steps in this debate. The first was that they needed to prove that most circumstances of when this strategy is implemented is untimely. Secondly, they needed to prove to us why it is harmful for the economy. And thirdly, they needed to tell us why it doesn't empower developing countries. First, on citizen livelihood then. Here, I'm going to prove why exporting labor is going to help individuals and by extension, the family. But know that this is only one metric of why this strategy is good. The rebuttal we received here from Prop is that families will move away along with the person, and therefore developing countries will be hit very hard. There are a few assumptions here. The first is that moving away is generally a bad thing. We think that there are still a magnitude of things that you can do for your country, even when your family is in a different country. These things look like providing skills via the internet to your home country, or sending things like remittances, or donating to charities, and raising attention in, for example, corporations in that country. For example, if you manage to get very high in a very high position in a company in the USA, you can tell them about how your background, your homegrown background in, for example, maybe China, and you can tell them why China has a lot of opportunities for more investment, and therefore that's a way you can really buttress your own country. But also, the second thing we told you was that people still have personal connections to their home country, right? In a foreign countries, and this is the POI we gave, you still feel alienated when you're working there, right? You have social media that sensationalizes your own country's perhaps crisis, and you want to help your own country. So this looks like perhaps even moving back and helping sending money there. But the last thing is just like, for example, if you look at historical cases, most people from countries, from developing countries, had a lot of like a large number of people in the population. Look at, for example, China. When it was developing, it had a huge rise in the population. And the moment when Deng Xiaoping unlocked the gates to the foreign world, whereas when there is so much interaction and so much new trade because of the extra labor that your country had. That's an advantage that a lot of developing countries have. And we think that because there's overpopulation in a lot of these countries, it doesn't really matter if some people go away, just as long as they still send things back and a lot of people still come back. Just on this citizen livelihood clash, we think it's very reasonable to assume and to be proved and to think that people will still come back and the country will be benefited. But what is Crop's counterfactual quickly on this? They tell us that they will just develop their local industry, right? They don't give us reasons for why corruption and nepotism and ignorance of the minority don't happen on their side. These factors are less likely to affect labor exportation because it's just exporting them. It's just you're allowing them to go to foreign countries. Instead, things like corruption are more likely to happen on their side of the house when things are local, when the local industry is corrupted by certain officials, when you're unable to make any meaningful product or education because each of those filthy officials keep stuffing money into their own pockets. This is a unique harm on proposition, and we think basically their counterfactual is crippled. Without the usage of labor exportation, a lot of developing countries wouldn't have gone a long way because of the systematic corruption that existed within those systems. So here we're going to weigh off even the types of counterfactuals that Prop has with just the fact that citizens can contribute to their home country even when they're outside, but most likely they're going to move back. Second clash then, how do we use this strategy in special economic circumstances? A bulk of our case in LO was how we can use the exportation of labor as a tool during economic circumstances, just like fiscal and monetary policies are tools to also help the economy. This was ignored and basically ignored by proposition, right? We think that governments can use this policy easy via the recommendation by the economic sector. For example, the federal bank of a certain country and the central bank of a certain country can tell the government to send more workers out because there is an increasing in an unemployment level. Because the moment when you send workers out is when the unemployment level is able to decrease because you have less demand, you have less supply for labor, and that's when industries can keep moving along. Before I move on, yeah, I'll take it.
Can you state an example of where that happened in real life?
China. Okay, I'm going to weigh the situation, right? We think that the usage of special circumstances is very impactful because the moment when you're able to send workers out is when you resolve special circumstances. You don't need to use the interest rate anymore. You can send workers out. This is a viable tool and it was very beneficial in historical situations. What is the third clash? The power of developing countries is going to be increased on our side of the house, right? We told you that you're going to empower ASEAN the moment when America uses a lot lot of its workers uses a lot of Filipino workers, or for example, Mexican workers, or for example, Chinese workers. That's because multinational corporations will now depend, a lot of their profits will now depend on these foreign workers, right? This means that they're going to either want a long-term contract. That means that development in your own country is likely to be sustainable. It means it's going to be sustainable and very good in the long run. But secondly, they're more likely to come to your country and help your country in terms of improving its own worker skills, so they can hire more of your workers in the future. All of these mechanisms on the state level, on the individual level, and on the corporation level prove why opposition takes the win.
Thank you very much, Opposition Whip. I'll now call upon the op reply. Here.
Okay, hi. I need to get my timer. Okay, cool, thanks. So my time starts in 3, 2, 1. Gulf strategy has been clear in this debate. They first want to force us to engage in the literal worst scenario possible under a vacuum, and secondly, wash out all our analysis by saying that it's symmetric because they have a counterfactual. This issue, the issue with this strategy is that we're not debating the motion. This house prefers a vacuum where exportation of labor is implemented. Their brain drain argument is best still outweighed by our argument, because our fundamental argument is that in times of economic crisis, when countries implement this type of policy, even if brain drain occurs, we're able to save these people's lives. So therefore, I don't see like what is the actual impacts occurring in this debate. First, I want to just generally clarify what the policy looks like, right? Because the deadlock was that government said the Philippines sent nurses and they would lose jobs because they didn't need nurses. America didn't need nurses anymore. We gave you structural reasons as to why the strategy is usually employed in times of crisis, and usually like the government doesn't send you families, right? The first thing is just that generally governments believe internal economy is good, right? Like when you have economy cycling yourself, when you're consumers are paying producers and the producers are being benefited, making a profit, and there's innovation, is generally a good thing. And therefore, governments are more likely going to implement it in their own countries. If you really want an example, we gave you China. Secondly, it's not possible to just send everyone, right? Like they said that, oh, you're going to lack like exportation power. Like China had a population of like 1 billion people. They're not going to send 1 billion people all to America for exporting labor, right? They're probably going to send like a percentage, like probably like 0.1% overseas. The majority of the people are still working in the country. The majority of people are still going to be like exporting things. We have plenty of people exporting. We told you that there's specifically like overpopulation. We have enough people, right? So therefore, I think generally it's just that, like thirdly, it's just unlikely to move family, right? Because it's a developing country. Like countries don't have enough money to like send you in a time of crisis to America and then also please you, right? Generally, it's just that they're probably going to go back, and like these workers are probably going to go back and probably give remittances at worst. So government basically on this clash debated on example of Philippines, where we gave you structural reasons as to why governments will use this as a tool, because the motion specifically says it's a strategy, not a vacuum. So therefore, I think easily we win this clash. But second, what was completely unengaged on? Because take government at best, right? Like let's concede in the worst case that sure, there might be brain drain. And we think that it is fine because we proved from LO that in a time of crisis, when people cannot find shelter, food, they have to beg on the streets to listen to a drop of a coin. We think that they can go to America. Like, sure, it's a good thing if they get employed by like Amazon, because they at least get paid, right? At least in the worst case, like they at least go, like if they don't come back, at least they survive. So therefore, I think that simply the livelihoods of the families are the most important impact in this debate. We have heard no engagement except for brain drain. They're not going to come back. Developing countries are not developing. We think that generally development in the country hinges upon the fact that people need to live. So therefore, we're happy to trade off brain drain for this argument. But lastly, how have they not sufficiently engaged upon the argument about international trade relations? Because we gave you the example of ASEAN, that basically people need to, in order to develop, right? No developing country can catch up with the speed of like China or America if they don't have foreign intervention, if they have foreign like support, right? And therefore they need MNCs to intervene, because when you're able to go to foreign countries and when you're able to get employed and when you're able to advocate for your own country and show that you have plenty of business opportunities because they're under an economic crisis and that they need support right now. Therefore, more countries are more likely going to invest in infrastructure, invest in job opportunities in those countries. This has been insufficiently responded to because their only one-liner is just that, well, companies won't go, right? This was just an assertion that we've heard that is not a sufficient response. So therefore, in essence, we prove that we save people's lives. We disprove that there is absolutely no brain drain. But thirdly, if the brain drain exists, it's still fine. But lastly, that we're able to get companies to invest in the developing country that helps the development. For these reasons, we're extremely proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. I'll reply to wrap the debate up as a whole. I call the Gov reply. Here.
Hello. Okay, starting my speech in, hold up, wait a second. Okay, starting my speech then in 3, 2, 1, go. Opposition's case runs on multiple assumptions. So at the point at which we're able to disprove all of them, you ought to give the opposition, like you have to the win the proposition. Firstly, opposition assumes that the overseas workers will give money to their families in the future. I think that one, they try to assert this by saying that people feel in debt in their home country, but actually, we don't have to see why this is true. Because if anything, these people will feel even more in debt to the country that has helped them earn the money in these outside this developing country, this new country they migrated to, which is now going to be a lot much more proximate to them. That's the reason why they're more likely and more incentivized to create a better society there. They're more likely to put all of their money into creating a better and safer world for the future generations that are going to live in this newer country, not in this older one from this like developing country. At the very most, if not like at the very least, we tell you that the developing country then goes to become like this country where they can go visit once in a while, but are very unlikely to get extremely attached to because it's the new life that they have outside of it. But even if anything, realize that the money that they have to give back is extremely low. It's cut down on so many levels because their salaries have gone through so many other factors, such as their own living condition, the fact that they have to like pass by like so many other countries and things like that. We tell you for that, their money that they're actually going to be getting by these overseas workers isn't even that much. It's not really worth you like money and like value that way. Secondly, opposition relies on the foreign countries investing on developing ones. We tell you that at the same time they say this, they don't actually explain what is extremely valuable about these developing countries that everyone would want to invest in it. What is the bargaining chip? Opposition is essentially just working in the vacuum on their own. We give you that in our counterfactual when we say that we would rather have all of these funds go to local government institutions because one, they benefit the people who actually need them, but two, they also serve as an investment opportunity, the bargaining chip for other foreign countries to actually invest in yours. Because of that, even if opposition wants to assert that corruption exists on our side, we see it a lot much more easier to track because one, you can actually see what is happening to these things. It's not something that's just like money that goes to like scholarships, but instead they become actual buildings in this kind of country. You know, the corruption is going to be a lot much less because you can physically see the impact of your taxes and things like that. That's the reason why it's a lot much more easier to hold accountability for these people. I think it's really weird for them to like start giving us this rebuttal on wet only. But thirdly, let's talk about these strategies opposition uses. I think it's the most important thing in this debate, right? Because the main plan that they like essentially posit to us is that they want to promote money circulation. But I think the main idea to that is that it's not exclusive. The reason why we can still get money circulation on our side is because with the manpower that we're able to keep on our side, we can build these infrastructure, we can have all of the job opportunities that are so much more needed for these investments to even exist in the first place. So again, even if like opposition wants to run and say that, oh, we need like a lot of rich people to come to these countries and you can do that through like getting more people to be seen and like in the like international stage, we think it's extremely unlikely for these people to still go to these developing countries and find something to invest on because there is literally nothing there. There's nothing valuable. That's the reason why education is something that is actually important because the point at which all these other countries have like an extra amount of features, they now have the ability to come to like this developing country and actually still earn a living and invest in it. But further from that, really the countries coming from these developing countries, like all these foreign trade and things like that happening to these countries, they're more likely to earn the money. That's the reason why we have the investments on our side. But lastly, we can say that even throughout this entire debate, opposition could not stick to one side. They tell you that one, it's bad for people to go out of the country. Two, it's actually good for these people to go out of the country because they need to earn money. Three, we need money circulation. I understand what is the point of this debate on the general and opposition side because they can't pick which like stance they want to take. But further, what is one thing that you can only get from government side? We give you the idea that these people can still have this country that can actually live on. Because without these people actually leaving this country, if everyone was to leave this developing country, this country would easily just fall to the ground. Because one, there's no people to actually like portray the like, economy and like the market and keep it alive. Secondly, there's nothing to actually help these and support these countries, like these developing countries, as the government has nothing to give them because they just keep exporting people outside. But thirdly, we also make sure these people are still living like relatively safe lives in these countries, since in our counterfactual, we would rather have these institutions actually protect them. For all these reasons, we have to propose. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much, God, for replying. Thanks everyone for an amazing debate. So we can just end around here.